China is supposedly weakening. That's the story. Property crisis, demographics, capital flight, local government debt, foreign companies diversifying supply chains. Every few weeks, another headline appears explaining why China's best days are behind it. And yet, something doesn't fit. A country in irreversible decline does not dominate electric vehicles, solar panels, batteries, commercial drones, shipbuilding, rare earth processing, industrial robotics deployment, high-speed rail manufacturing, telecommunications equipment, consumer electronics assembly, steel production, chemical refining, critical mineral processing, e-commerce logistics, and increasingly, advanced manufacturing machinery. Those aren't opinions, they're industries. And industries have a habit of revealing reality long before narratives catch up. The number that caught my attention wasn't a GDP figure, it wasn't a stock market index, it wasn't even an export statistic. It was 14 major industries where China now holds either dominant global market share, decisive supply chain control, or manufacturing leadership, many of them originating in the United States, Europe, or Japan. That doesn't mean China invented everything. Far from it. The American economy remains the world's most powerful engine of scientific research, venture capital, advanced software, aerospace innovation, and frontier technology. The United States still leads in many of the technologies that determine the future. But invention and dominance are not the same thing. The Wright brothers invented powered flight. Boeing became an industrial giant. Yet today, China builds more commercial ships than the rest of the world combined. The United States pioneered modern solar technology. Today, over 80% of the global solar supply chain runs through China. America helped create the modern lithium-ion battery industry. China now processes most of the materials required to build them. Notice the pattern. The story isn't that China became innovative overnight. The story is that China became exceptionally good at something different. Industrial scale. That's a less glamorous skill than invention. Nobody makes movies about supply chain optimization. Nobody writes best-selling books about precision casting equipment or cathode manufacturing facilities. Yet those boring capabilities determine who captures the economic value once an industry matures. And that's where many discussions about China become strangely disconnected from reality. A lot of analysis treats economic competition like a science fair. Who invented the technology? Who filed the patent? Who published the paper? Those questions matter. But eventually, somebody has to manufacture 10 million units instead of 10,000. Eventually, somebody has to build supplier networks, logistics corridors, machine tool ecosystems, component clusters, training systems, and financing mechanisms. That stage of competition receives far less attention because it's less exciting. It's also where most victories are decided. A useful example comes from solar energy. The United States helped pioneer photovoltaic technology decades ago. European firms pushed commercialization. For a while, many analysts assumed Western companies would dominate the sector permanently. Instead, Beijing identified solar manufacturing as a strategic industry during successive 5-year plans. Provincial governments provided land, infrastructure, financing, and procurement support. Companies expanded capacity relentlessly. The result? By the time many Western competitors realized what was happening, Chinese firms weren't merely competing. They were setting global prices. There is a dry irony here. For years, policymakers across multiple countries argued that manufacturing was becoming less important than services. China listened, then proceeded to become the world's manufacturing center anyway. That decision may turn out to be one of the most consequential economic bets of the 21st century. But before we go further, we need to separate two different claims that are often mixed together. Claim 1. China's economy has serious problems. True. Claim 2. Therefore, China's industrial position is collapsing. Much harder to defend. These are not the same statement. A country can experience financial stress while strengthening strategic industries. History provides plenty of examples. In fact, some of China's current industrial gains occurred during periods when Western media coverage was overwhelmingly focused on domestic weakness. Which raises an uncomfortable question. What if we've been measuring the wrong things? Because while investors were watching apartment prices in Shenzhen and debt levels in local governments, something else was happening inside factories, ports, refineries, battery plants, machine tool workshops, and research parks across the country. Production capacity was compounding. And industrial ecosystems have a peculiar characteristic. Once they reach sufficient scale, they become extremely difficult to dislodge. Remember that number from the opening? 14. The interesting part isn't that China leads those industries. The interesting part is how it captured them. Because when you examine the mechanism closely, you start seeing the same sequence repeated again and again. And it explains far more about the future of global power than any quarterly GDP report ever could. The simplest explanation for China's rise is that it subsidized industries. That's true. It's also incomplete. Lots of governments subsidize industries. The United States subsidizes industries. Europe subsidizes industries. Japan did it. South Korea did it. The difference isn't the existence of subsidies. The difference is what happened after the money arrived. China built ecosystems. That sounds abstract until you see what it means on the ground. Take electric vehicles. The global conversation usually revolves around companies like BYD or Tesla. But an electric vehicle isn't a single product. It's thousands of interconnected components: batteries, cathodes, anodes, power electronics, motors, magnets, sensors, software, charging systems, aluminum castings, wiring harnesses, and logistics networks. The company assembling the final vehicle is only the visible layer. The real advantage sits underneath. By the early 2020s, a Chinese EV manufacturer could source nearly every major component domestically, often within a few hundred miles of the final assembly plant. That reduces costs. It reduces delivery times. It reduces uncertainty. Most importantly, it creates a feedback loop. A supplier improves. The manufacturer benefits. Demand rises. Suppliers expand. Costs fall. Competitors struggle to match pricing. The cycle repeats. Industrial ecosystems don't grow in straight lines. They compound. This is where many Western analyses underestimate what happened. People imagine industries as individual companies competing against each other. China approached them as networks. The battery industry illustrates the point perfectly. In 2010, many experts assumed battery leadership would remain divided among Japanese, South Korean, American, and European firms. That seemed reasonable. The technology was complex. The barriers to entry were high. The market itself was still developing. Then Beijing made a decision. Instead of focusing solely on battery manufacturing, it targeted the entire chain: lithium processing, nickel refining, cathode materials, battery equipment, cell production, recycling, electric vehicle adoption, charging infrastructure, everything. The result was not one dominant company. It was an industrial environment where dozens of companies became stronger together. Today, when a battery factory opens in another country, there is a good chance some of the machinery came from China, some of the processed materials came from China, and many of the technical inputs passed through Chinese supply chains at some stage. That's not market share, that's infrastructure. And infrastructure is much harder to replace than products. Think about commercial shipbuilding. The United States effectively invented the modern industrial economy that made global shipping possible. During World War II, American shipyards launched vessels at a pace that remains astonishing even today. Yet modern commercial shipbuilding tells a different story. China now produces over half of the world's commercial ships. Not because American engineers suddenly forgot how to build ships, because shipbuilding migrated into an ecosystem where steel production, port infrastructure, supplier networks, skilled labor pools, financing institutions, and government priorities aligned in the same direction. One factory matters. An ecosystem matters more. There is a lesson here that extends far beyond China. Manufacturing isn't simply about labor costs anymore. If low wages were the deciding factor, production would have left China years ago. Chinese manufacturing wages have risen dramatically over the last 2 decades. And yet, many industries became even more concentrated there. Why? Because once enough suppliers cluster together, efficiency starts outweighing labor costs. A factory manager doesn't care only about wages. They care about whether components arrive on time, whether machinery can be repaired quickly, whether engineers are available, whether suppliers can scale production next month instead of next year, whether financing exists, whether logistics work. The ecosystem becomes the product. A useful example came during the COVID era. Companies across the world suddenly discovered how dependent they were on Chinese manufacturing networks. Some executives believed moving production elsewhere would be straightforward. Then, reality intervened. Relocating a factory is difficult. Relocating thousands of suppliers, technicians, logistics providers, machine tool specialists, chemical processors, and infrastructure assets is something entirely different. Many discovered they weren't dealing with a factory. They were dealing with an industrial civilization. There's a difference. And this brings us back to the central question. If China's economy faces genuine structural challenges, and it does, why haven't those challenges translated into industrial decline? Part of the answer lies in timing. Industrial ecosystems operate on decades. Financial crises operate on quarters. News cycles operate on days. The timelines are completely different. A debt problem can emerge quickly. An industrial advantage takes years to build and years to lose. That's why so many predictions about China's imminent manufacturing collapse have repeatedly failed. They assume industrial power is more fragile than it actually is. Sometimes it is, often it isn't. But there is a complication that changes the entire story. Because if China were simply winning through cheap labor and massive factories, the long-term implications would be limited. Factories can be copied. Production eventually moves. History has seen that before. The more significant development is happening somewhere else, and it forces us to revisit an assumption that has shaped discussions about China for decades. The assumption that China excels at manufacturing but remains dependent on others for the most advanced technology. That argument used to be stronger than it is today. The reason becomes clear when we look at what happened after 2018. And that's where the story takes a turn many people still haven't fully absorbed. October 7th, 2022. That date may end up being remembered as one of the most important turning points in modern industrial history. The United States introduced sweeping export controls aimed at slowing China's access to advanced semiconductors and chip-making equipment. Washington's logic was straightforward. Advanced chips are the foundation of artificial intelligence, military systems, supercomputers, autonomous platforms, and next-generation industry. Limit access to the most advanced technology. Slow technological advancement. Preserve the lead. It was a rational strategy. In fact, many analysts believed it would work. There was good reason to think so. The world's most advanced semiconductor ecosystem was concentrated among a handful of players. American companies dominated critical software tools. Dutch firm ASML controlled extreme ultraviolet lithography. Japanese firms held key positions in materials and equipment. Taiwan's TSMC operated the most advanced manufacturing facilities on Earth. China appeared vulnerable, at least on paper. And this is where the story becomes more complicated than either side likes to admit. The controls absolutely hurt China. Anyone claiming otherwise isn't taking the evidence seriously. Chinese companies lost access to cutting-edge technologies. Research timelines became harder. Development costs increased. Certain capabilities remain constrained today. But something else happened. The pressure triggered the largest industrial substitution effort in modern Chinese history. Instead of abandoning strategic sectors, Beijing accelerated support for domestic alternatives. Money flowed into chip equipment firms. Provincial governments expanded semiconductor funds. Research institutes received new mandates. Universities increased engineering recruitment. State-backed investment vehicles began targeting bottlenecks throughout the supply chain. Remember the pattern from Part 2? Not a company, an ecosystem. The same approach that had worked in batteries, solar panels, and electric vehicles was suddenly being applied to semiconductors. And here's the reversal. The sanctions were designed to preserve technological leadership, yet in some sectors, they may have accelerated China's determination to reduce dependence altogether. Those are not the same outcome. A useful comparison comes from aerospace history. During the Cold War, restrictions often encouraged domestic development rather than preventing it. The process was slower, more expensive, less efficient. But dependence gradually decreased. China appears to be pursuing a similar path, not because it's easy, because it believes it has no alternative. Huawei became the symbol of this shift. For years, many observers assumed the company had been effectively neutralized after sanctions. Then, something unexpected happened. In 2023, Huawei released a smartphone containing an advanced domestically produced processor manufactured by SMIC. The reaction wasn't significant because the chip matched the absolute frontier. It didn't. The reaction mattered because the chip existed at all. A capability many outsiders believed was years away had appeared much sooner than expected. One phone doesn't determine the future, but it revealed something important. Predictions about China's technological limits were becoming less reliable. There is a tendency in geopolitical analysis to think in binary terms: winning, losing, leading, falling behind. Reality rarely cooperates. China still trails the United States in several critical technologies: artificial intelligence models, advanced semiconductor design, aerospace systems, scientific research quality at the highest levels. Frontier innovation remains an area where America retains enormous strengths. That matters a lot. But the opposite side of the equation matters too, because leadership at the frontier and dominance across an industrial landscape are different forms of power. A country does not need to invent every breakthrough if it controls the infrastructure required to scale many of them. That's the distinction many discussions miss. Think about artificial intelligence. The public conversation focuses on models: GPT models, Claude, Gemini. Who has the smartest AI? Interesting question. But eventually, those models require data centers, power generation, electrical equipment, cooling systems, industrial automation, robotics, supply chains, semiconductors, advanced materials, physical infrastructure. The digital world still rests on a physical foundation, and China increasingly controls large portions of that foundation. This brings us back to the number 14. Because those industries are not isolated victories, they reinforce one another. Steel supports shipbuilding. Shipbuilding supports exports. Exports support industrial investment. Industrial investment strengthens machinery production. Machinery improves manufacturing productivity. Productivity improves competitiveness. Competitiveness generates capital for the next round of expansion. The ecosystem compounds again. Notice what we're really describing: not an economy, an industrial system. And industrial systems often prove more durable than financial headlines suggest, which doesn't mean China is invincible. Far from it. The demographic challenge is real. Debt remains serious. Productivity growth cannot be taken for granted. Political mistakes are possible. Capital allocation isn't always efficient. These weaknesses exist. The question is whether they outweigh the advantages already accumulated. I'm not entirely convinced they do. At least not yet. Because when I look at the last decade, I see something many forecasts underestimated. China didn't simply become the world's factory. It became increasingly capable of building the machines that build the factories. That's a very different level of industrial maturity, and it changes the conversation from "can China manufacture products?" to something much larger. Who controls the architecture of global production itself? That's the question we'll end with, because the answer may determine far more than trade balances or economic rankings. It may determine what the next era of global power actually looks like. Let's go back to the assumption we started with. China is weakening. Depending on what you're measuring, that statement can be true. Growth has slowed compared to the extraordinary expansion of previous decades. The property sector remains under pressure. Birth rates are falling. Local government debt is substantial. Foreign investment has become more cautious. None of that should be ignored. The mistake is assuming those facts automatically determine the outcome of industrial competition. History doesn't work that neatly. The United States in the 1970s faced inflation, oil shocks, political turmoil, and questions about decline. Yet it remained the world's technological leader. Japan entered decades of slower growth after its asset bubble burst. It still retained industrial capabilities that many countries could only admire. Economic challenges matter. Industrial capacity matters too. Sometimes they're moving in opposite directions. That's why I think the debate around China is often framed incorrectly. People argue about whether China is rising or falling, as if those are the only two options. The reality is stranger. China may be experiencing slower economic growth while simultaneously strengthening parts of its industrial position. Those developments can coexist. In fact, we're watching it happen. Consider what global manufacturers are actually doing. Not what politicians say, but what companies with billions of dollars at stake are doing. Many are diversifying supply chains. That's real. Vietnam is gaining production. India is attracting investment. Mexico is benefiting from nearshoring. Indonesia is moving up the value chain. All true. Yet when you examine the details, a surprising amount of that diversification still passes through Chinese industrial networks. Factories move, suppliers remain, components travel, machinery arrives, technical expertise follows. The map changes, the ecosystem often doesn't. That's why replacing China has proven far more difficult than many expected. Replacing a country is impossible. Replacing an ecosystem is harder still. And this brings us to what I think is the most underappreciated part of the story. The real competition isn't between America and China, at least not primarily. It's between two different models of economic power. The American model excels at discovery, research universities, venture capital, software, advanced science, breakthrough innovation. The Chinese model excels at scaling, manufacturing clusters, infrastructure deployment, supply chain integration, industrial coordination. Neither system is complete on its own, which is why the most technologically advanced products on Earth often contain contributions from both. An AI model designed with American software may run in a data center containing Chinese manufactured equipment, powered by minerals processed in China, using chips designed in California and fabricated in Taiwan. Modern industrial power isn't a straight line, it's a web. The question is, who occupies the most important nodes? And over the last 20 years, China has quietly secured a remarkable number of them. That doesn't guarantee future success. This is where I have a doubt. Can Beijing maintain industrial momentum while managing demographic decline, rising wages, geopolitical pressure, and a more hostile external environment? I'm not certain. Nobody should be. Large systems rarely move in straight lines forever. Every dominant industrial power eventually encounters constraints. Britain did, America has, Japan did, China will too. The question is timing, not whether, timing. My opinion is that many Western observers have spent too much time looking at China's weaknesses and not enough time studying its strengths. The weaknesses are easier to discuss. The strengths are harder because they require understanding logistics, manufacturing, materials science, industrial policy, and supply chains. Subjects that generate fewer headlines than real estate crises or stock market fluctuations. Yet those less glamorous areas often decide who holds economic leverage 20 years later. Remember that number from the opening, 14. 14 industries where China achieved a position that many considered impossible a generation ago. Not because it invented them first, because it mastered the stage that comes after invention: scale, coordination, persistence. And perhaps that's the larger lesson here. Countries don't become powerful merely by creating technologies. They become powerful when they build systems capable of producing those technologies relentlessly, year after year, at a scale competitors struggle to match. That's what we're really looking at, not a temporary news cycle, not a quarterly earnings report, not even a debate about whether China's GDP grows at 4% or 5%. We're watching a contest over who controls the industrial foundations of the 21st century. My prediction? Over the next decade, the biggest geopolitical surprises won't come from who invents the next breakthrough. They'll come from who manufactures it, supplies it, finances it, and turns it into something billions of people can actually use. And if current trends continue, China will remain far more central to that process than many forecasts are willing to admit. Which is why every few months I read another headline declaring China's imminent collapse. Then look at the export data, the factory output, the battery plants, the shipyards, the industrial machinery orders, and wonder whether the factories got the memo. If you enjoyed this analysis, subscribe and come back for the next one. There are a few more assumptions about the global economy that deserve the same treatment.